Good afternoon. On behalf of Ed Steele, Chairman and CEO of EAS Consulting Group, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, part 2 of a Good Manufacturing Practices Short Course based on 21 CFR 111. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with a prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, cosmetic, and tobacco firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives, and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenters are Mark Allman, an attorney with Rivkin Radler, Robert Fish, an EAS independent advisor for quality and compliance, and Tara Couch, EAS Senior Director for Dietary Supplements and Tobacco Services. Mark Ullman represents clients in matters relating to all aspects of a firm's practice, including FDA, DEA, regulatory issues, FTC proceedings, and litigation. Mr. Fish joined EAS in November of 2006 after 10 years of consulting for FDA regulated industries. He spent 33 years with FDA, the last 6 of which as Director, Division of Field Investigations. He was responsible for general policy and guidance for the agency's domestic and international investigation activities. Dr. Couch is a PhD analytical organic chemist with exceptional analytical abilities and over 25 years of diverse laboratory and regulatory experience in academic, field, contract, experts on issues pertaining to quality control in both pharmaceutical and dietary supplement manufacturing facilities. As a reminder, during today's webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the chat box. With that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Tara.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining the second session of our GMP Compliance Short Course based on dietary supplements. So today we're going to talk about specifications and testing, material control, holding and distribution operations, the requirements for own label distributors, and managing FDA inspections. And of course, then we'll have some time for quality questions and answers at the end, and a few moments for closing comments. So if you recall, if you were able to join us on the first session, we've chosen these topics based on the FDA's guidance on what's going on with the warning letters and what's going on with enforcement, and we talked about that a little bit. So one of the largest areas of enforcement is specifications and testing. So that's where we're going to start off today, and that's dictated in subpart E of 21 CFR 111. So here we're just going to go through what some of those regulations say. So in 11170B, we talk about having, the FDA talks about having component specifications or raw material specifications. Those are in 11170B, as I indicated, and those must meet the qualifications for identity, purity, strength, composition, and limits on those types of contaminants that may adulterate the product. The same thing is true in 11170C. However, now we're talking about in-process specifications. So this is at any point, step, or stage of the master manufacturing process, and it also has to meet those same 5 requirements. In 11170D, we must comply with 21 CFR 101, which is the food labeling requirements, and all packaging components also must have specifications to make sure that they're safe and suitable for their intended use. In 11170E, we talk about product specifications. Product specifications are back to the requirements of identity, purity, strength, composition, and the contaminants, and again, we have to have these specifications established. There are situations where we may use contractors to make the product, and then we would package the product after that fact, and so that's talked about in 11170F. So we have to have specifications, even if we're not the ones that have manufactured the product, we have to have specifications to make sure that we're getting ready to label it appropriately. And then, of course, there are packaging and labeling specifications. So this is the final bottle configuration or final packaging configuration that you're going to use, and you'd have to have specifications for that, and this is typically dictated in your packaging batch record. So to summarize all of that, we have specifications for raw materials, specifications for in-process materials during the manufacturing process itself, And then we also have packaging for labeling and packaging components separately, and then finished product specifications. Regardless of where they're coming from, these have to address all of the bulk product, so all of the strength and everything that you need for the bulk product, as well as the packaging and labeling that is going to go on that product before it's distributed to the consumer. So the raw materials and in-process materials and finished product specifications all have to meet those 5 requirements. So these 5 requirements are repeated over and over and over in the regulations, and you're going to hear me do the exact same thing today, because if you recall from last week, Mark talked about the different enforcement actions, and 55% of the 43s and warning letters that have been issued in the last 6 years are related to specifications and testing. So nearly every warning letter that you see has something about specifications as one of the observations. Packaging components have to be safe, suitable for their intended use, and not reactive or absorptive, so we have to have specifications that will talk about that. And then, as I mentioned, labels must comply with 21 CFR 101.9 in particular, to make sure that they meet the supplement facts requirements and all other labeling requirements for a dietary supplement. Despite this huge discussion about specifications in the regulation, the FDA provided no definition in subpart A of the regulation for what a specification is. However, the ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization, does have a definition for specifications, and that's provided here. A specification is defined as a list of tests, reference to analytical procedures, and appropriate acceptance criteria, which are numerical limits, ranges, or other criteria for the tests described. So we have this acceptance criteria, and that means we should have both upper and lower limits applied for all of our strength specifications on the finished product. Now, we are a classification of foods as a dietary supplement. So again, that means we have to comply with the regulations that are dictated in 21 CFR 101. And what that says is amounts present for added nutrients must be at least 100% of the amount that's declared on the label. So if we have a claim for vitamin C, for example, of 100 milligrams, there must be at least 100 milligrams of vitamin C in that formulation. It cannot be 98, it has to be 100%. So a dietary supplement that doesn't meet this requirement is considered misbranded because it's not meeting the label claim. For raw materials, again, we're going to have an upper lower limits to make sure that we're going to meet product, and because our finished product is also going to have upper limits, we'll have to have an upper limit on our raw materials as well to make sure that they don't come in too high and would result in the product having too high of a level. And the idea of having this specification is really for the benefit of you too. So you don't want to pay for something that you're not getting, and you don't want to have something that's too potent that's going to disrupt your formulation. So this is also very important for us in the industry. You'll also see NMTs and NLTs. So NMTs are not more than, and NLTs are not less than. So these are typically used when you're talking about microbiological purity and other types of contaminants such as heavy metals or pesticides. So what we'll have to do is create this specification. So there will be a specification form that you use to document this list of tests, the test method procedures, and the corresponding acceptance criteria. Remember, that was our definition from the ICH. So we'll have to list all of these. So because we have to hit these 5 categories, it's a good idea for your raw material, in-process material, and your finished product specification to organize your specification in that way. So you'd have those 5 categories: identity, purity, strength, composition, and contaminants. For your packaging components, those aren't the quality requirements. You have 3 quality requirements. So the safety, the suitability for use, and then the reactive or absorptive criteria. So this would be any chemical reactions that would take place. And they have to be compliant, not complaint, with 21 CFR 101 for labels. So usually what this means for labels is you don't necessarily have a separate form per se, but what you're going to do is assign a master label. So you sign a master label that's compliant with 101.9, and then all the labels that you receive thereafter, every shipment of labels that you're going to use to package your product, you will make sure and compare that to that label. A great way of doing this is to print it out on clear sheets, and then you can just lay that sheet right over the label when it's received. So that makes it much, much easier to do a review of that label and make sure everything is exactly the same as what you've indicated on your master label. So these specifications will be formal documents. So they will be assigned a unique identification number, the documentation number. They will be managed through your change control system, and they will be tracked with the revision number. So anytime you change anything on the specification, you would have to rev that up to the next revision. And of course, as we talked about last week, they would have to be reviewed and approved by the quality unit. So here's an example template for what you would see for a raw material and a finished product specification. So you have some of the 411 information about the material itself or product itself up at the top, and then we've arranged this in according to those categories for quality, and we have the test, the specification, and the test method, right? So that's what we're going to show. And then of course at the bottom it's going to be reviewed and approved by the quality unit once this form has been completed. Similarly, for the packaging component, now it's set, instead of those 5 categories, we have the 3 categories that apply to packaging components. So for packaging components, this is your whole container closure system. So this is things like your bottle, your cap, your seal, the neck band, the outer band, if you're using desiccants or cotton internally. For your label, as I mentioned, these comply with 101.9. And labeling is not just the physical label that goes on the bottle or your finer container. So this is all the artwork. And what I was always taught was the romance panel. So any type of claim you make anywhere on the product would be is considered labeling. It also applies to pamphlets or inserts. And of course, the supplement fax panel. And nowadays in our world of electronics and social media, this also applies to your website. If you have any sort of Facebook page or any of that sort of stuff, all of the information that's out there that you put out there about your product is also considered labeling. So you have to be very cautious about the claims that you make out on social media as well. So again, what we would do is assign a reference or a master label and then verify receipt once we receive all of the incoming labels before they're used. And of course, this would be done in accordance to an SOP. In-process material specifications are typically incorporated into the master manufacturing record, and Bob talked to us last week about the master manufacturing record. So all of those things will be buried in there, and that's the most appropriate place to put it because that's actually where you're doing the operation, so that makes the most sense. So we will have specifications corresponding to every critical control point that we have in the master manufacturing process or in the manufacturing process. The MMR is of course also a formal document. So this will also get an identification number, the master manufacturing record itself. It will go through change control and have revision tracking and be reviewed and approved by the quality unit. So the tests that are indicated in that batch record, though, even though they're kind of scattered out, you have to still make sure they're hitting those 5 requirements. And they have to have the test name, the test method procedure, and the acceptance criteria. All of those have to be built into that master manufacturing record to be considered a specification. The same applies on the packaging side. Oftentimes you have a separate make job manufacturing record, and then you have a packaging job manufacturing record. So the requirements for the packaging and labeling, whether there's a desiccant, whether there's cotton that's provided, if it's an amber bottle, if it's a plastic bottle, all of those things would be included in the packaging batch record, and the specifications regarding those would also be in the packaging record. So again, it's the most practical location and most efficient way to conduct this. And this would usually, when you're talking about the product packaging and labeling specifications, most notably, these are usually visual examinations. There are some that are more involved than just a visual examination. So for example, if you're trying to do a seal check, there may be requirements for a seal, and you may not be able to verify that the seal integrity unless you do some sort of test to it other than just visual. When you receive the packaging components, of course, you will have packaging specifications for the packaging components, and that will be looking at that chain of the C of C or the C of A or any sort of guarantee that they have from the manufacturer of that product. If you're receiving the product already packaged and labeled, then you will use that same sort of mentality to get a certificate of analysis or a certificate of conformance or some sort of guarantee from them, and you would verify that that is meeting those requirements. So we created all of these specifications, and now we have to test according to these specifications. So we're going to have testing on your incoming raw materials, your in-process materials at all stages of the process, your incoming labels and packaging. Again, this is probably just visual, but it is still an examination. And then, of course, on our finished products. So just as a reminder, those are our 5 criteria that apply to raw materials, in-process materials, and finished products. So let's just take a little bit of a deeper dive into what those criteria mean. So obviously, identity sounds pretty self-explanatory. So it's the tests that are chosen to determine the identity of the raw must unequivocally delineate it from all other materials that are present in use or may be received by the facility. So it has to clearly indicate what it is. So the test that's used for identity could be an appearance test, it could be an organoleptic test, it could be a physical test, chemical, or a micro test. Most commonly, it's a combination of several of those things, and that's referred to as orthogonal testing. Back to identity, when we're talking about botanicals, this is one of the things that makes the dietary supplement world so exciting and fun, is that when we're talking about a botanical, on the label, again, in accordance to 101.9, we have to identify any botanicals by their genus and species and plant part. So the identity that we choose, the testing that we choose, must unequivocally delineate it that way. So we have to get it to the genus species level and to the plant part level. So that can be quite complicated if by the time you receive that botanical, it's a fine tanned white powder. So the tests that are necessary are usually a combination of these things, and sometimes even all of these different types of tests. For purity, microbiological purity is what the World Health Organization defines as purity. And so this can be one of the definitions of purity that you use to establish and meet this requirement for purity. So this is done with either agar plates, Petrifilm, there are rapid test kits, and there are instrumental microbiological analyzers, for example, as well, like a Solaris, for example. So these will be TPC, the total plate count, yeast and mold, Enterobacter, E. coli, Salmonella, Staph, Pseudomonas, and Listeria. So very recently, there's been a big push by the FDA about Listeria. We just had a guidance document come out about Listeria and had all the outbreaks that we've had with Listeria in recent years. So the type, number, and criteria that you use for your microbiological testing is going to be dependent on the material product. So as I mentioned, botanicals, those always make our life interesting in the dietary supplement world. Botanicals have the greatest potential for microbial contamination, particularly those that are grown organically. They will carry the highest microbial load. So therefore, you need to screen those for certain criteria. So Enterobacter, if you use the USP as a guidance document for establishing these specifications, Enterobacter is only necessary when you're doing a botanical powder, a straight botanical powder. When you go to an extract, there's been some sort of a cleanup step that's occurred, and Enterobacter should have been removed, most of it. So that is no longer a requirement on a specification. Fish and other types of ingredients that have high contents of water, in Colorado, we had 19 people die from Listeria contamination of cantaloupe, and that's because cantaloupe has a very high water content. So if you have ingredients that have that high water content, Listeria is something that you should certainly be screening those materials for. Materials that also come from an aqueous origin, fish as well, can also be subject to Pseudomonas, or if you have liquid products. Pseudomonas is particularly difficult for people of sensitive populations, so this would be for children and for the elderly. So if you have a product line that's going specifically to children and it may be liquid or is coming from a material that's coming from an aqueous source, this could be the pond, the lake, or the ocean, Pseudomonas may be something that you need to add to your specifications in this case. The manufacturing process is also important when we're talking about purity. If you're doing a wet granulation during your process, then you're obviously introducing moisture and you have the higher potential to have issues with microbial growth. So we refer to that as the happy dance when that happened on some of our products. So doing water activity during the manufacturing process can help evaluate that, or even just doing total aerobic plate count and making sure that that has been maintained. Strength testing applies to all of these materials as well. So this is a definitive procedure to prove the existence of the analyte and at the appropriate concentration. So in our vitamin C example, so if we claimed 100 milligrams of vitamin C, we would have to assay that product and the raw material for vitamin C and make sure we do in fact have 100 milligrams of vitamin C. For in-process materials, typically the chemical strength testing is handled on the raw material end and on the finished product end, so there isn't so much strength testing per se that you would see at the in-process point, but you would have to write a justification for what that is. There are situations when you can no longer test for the strength on the finished product because of the complexity of the matrix. And we have an allowance for an exemption in the regulation for that. And so therefore, you may do the strength testing earlier on in the process when the matrices is not quite so complicated. So there are options to do that as well. Composition is typically the physical tests of the material and product, but this may also include quantitative tests to determine the relative concentration of different materials that are in the product formulation. So this is conducted at all three phases again, the raw material, in process, and finished product stages. So you can kind of break this down by product type or product form. So if it's a powder, the composition is usually dictated by the particle size and or bulk density of the particular product. So the bulk density is going to be very important, because if you're saying to dose somebody by filling up a particular scoop, then you need to make sure that the bulk density is appropriate, that you'd have the right quantity in that scoop. So that's important. Same thing applies to particle size, right? So particle size, if you're trying to fill in, make that powder, you want to make sure that the particle sizes aren't too different and they're consistent from bottle to bottle, to make sure that you also get the same dosage each time the consumer takes that scoop or puts it in their spoon. So water and moisture content can also be determined for the powders to make sure that you have the right composition of moisture in that particular powder. Tablets are always assessed for hardness, thickness, friability. Tablet weight variation, and moisture content can also be important. Tablets have to disintegrate within the body in order for the ingredients to be absorbed and the consumer have any efficacy from that. So disintegration and or dissolution are also applied to tablets. Bulk and tap densities can also be used, and it can be very important to make sure that you can actually tablet that particular product and compress it. If the bulk density is too high, you may not be able to do that, and you won't be able to get it into your presses. So you have to make sure that that's appropriate. Capsules have a lot of the same things as tablets. So we're talking about the weights, the weight variation, but particle size is important here because we have to make sure that it fits into the capsule. So that is also something that's frequently done when we're talking about capsules at the in-process stage. Disintegration and or dissolution is also required, so we have to make sure that the capsule itself dissolves so that the person can have the efficacy from that, and then also the contents of that capsule so that we get that efficacy. For liquids, liquid supplements are usually assessed for things such as appearance, so there's no solids that are in the bottom, pH, total dissolved solids, there's actually tests for that, viscosity, relative density, and the bricks, which is the sugar content of those. Samples, when you're talking about liquids, liquids are more uniformly mixed because of the nature of being a liquid versus a solid, but what you'll do then is analyze those by the top, middle, and end. So there are thieves that you can use, which is basically a long metal stick that has different slots in it, and you make a rotation at the top and it'll collect the sample from 3 different layers of your solution. Contaminants is our final category, and again, one of those things that makes the dietary supplement industry very interesting. So because of the nature of a lot of the ingredients we have, there are a number of contaminants that we have to be concerned about in our dietary supplement products and in those materials. So metal fragments are something that are of concern in all sorts of manufacturing processes. So we are using metal equipment to make these products. So we can have equipment shear, you can have screens breaking. So these are all very important to make sure that you've removed the metal fragments and other types of physical contaminants that may be present in the product or the raw material. Heavy metals, so heavy metals are usually defined as, in accordance to Prop 65, they're called the Big Four often. This is arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. California has the lowest requirements for those, so if you're distributing your product into California, you need to be cognizant of following Prop 65 and meeting those requirements on your finished product. Pesticides are relevant, of course, for the botanicals that we're using in dietary supplements. So USP does have a chapter on pesticides, but defers to the EPA, which the EPA is that we should be screening in a dietary supplement. We also have residual solvents, which were formerly known as volatile organic impurities. This is really relevant when we're talking about botanical extracts in the dietary supplement industry, because these are extracted with different types of solvents. Ethanol, for example, there's a lot of ethanolic extractions. So those would be something that you would do. Some other countries actually use solvents that we would not use in the United States anymore. So they're using benzene or they're using pentane or things like that. So these are solvents that you'd also have to be screening for. Melamine. There was the incident back in 2009 where there were something like 30,000 children in China that were sickened because the protein content in their formula was being intentionally adulterated with melamine, which, yes, that is the plastic plates that you use in the summer. So melamine was used instead because the test, they both are amines, and the test was duped by the presence of this melamine. We also had this issue in the United States in dog food and cat food, and then it also was a problem in chocolate for a while. That year my children were not allowed to have any chocolate on Halloween. We also have to worry about allergens. So remember, we are a classification of foods, and if you follow the recalls at all, the vast majority of recalls are for allergens. So you have to make sure that you have an allergen program and you're screening your products for allergens so you don't have cross-contamination of those. In addition to that, if you're making a gluten-free claim on your product, gliadin is the wheat protein that causes the allergic reaction, so you have to be screening your products for gliadin and making sure that's not present. According to the FDA, the definition for gluten-free is less than 20 parts per million of gliadin, so you have to make sure that you're verifying that. Raw materials are usually the source of all of these contaminants. So it's a good idea to have the heavy lifting for contamination done on your raw materials. So very rarely, unless you have a very, very poor GMP system, you're not going to introduce metal fragments. You're not going to introduce heavy metals or pesticides or residual solvents or melamine or allergens in your process. So if you've done all the testing on your raw materials, you may not have to do it on your finished products. Now, certainly there are some exceptions to that, as there always are. So if you have a large product formulation, which many of us do, and you have many sources of heavy metals, for example, in your raw materials and in your product, there are many of those that can contribute to heavy metals. You got a bunch of minerals, you got a bunch of botanicals in there. What can happen is on your raw material side, you can screen those and all of these be below your quantitation limit, but you can have a cumulative effect and those can all add up and you can go over the top in your finished product. So you will also have to do heavy metal testing in your finished product if you have a bunch of those that can contribute. This is really exacerbated for heavy metals because the California, I mentioned the Prop 65, their requirement is not in concentration units, it's in micrograms per day. So then in terms of physical contaminants, I know that we mentioned the metal fragments. So metal screening is necessary. Some people will do this at all three stages. They will do this on the incoming raw materials if you've had some challenges coming from your suppliers with metal fragments. Most people will certainly do it in process because that's most likely where that could be introduced. So you want to make sure that you have those detectors. So you look for ferrous and non-ferrous, and there are fantastic equipment that can be put online, and there's also offline equipment, and then a lot of people will put it on the end of their packaging line as well in the finished bottles. So we talked about the heavy metals a little bit with the Prop 65. So here is that Prop 65. It's actually the State of California Environmental Protection Agency Office of Environmental Health, Hazard Assessment, Safety, Drinking Water, and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1996. That's why we all call it Prop 65. Nobody wants to say that over and over again. Heavy metals are ubiquitously found in the environment, so that means they're pretty much everywhere. So anything that comes from the ground is subject to potential heavy metal contamination. So this would be minerals that are mined from the ground or botanicals. And these will be absorbed up into the botanicals, and then they'll be hard to remove from the minerals when they're mined together. Pesticides are used obviously for control of pest populations and to prevent disease on plants, but these are toxic chemicals and they will bioaccumulate in people and in animals. So you have to make sure that we're screening for those. And it isn't necessarily just the field where your raw materials may have been harvested from. There are also nearby fields if you've got water runoff that will go into that field. Now the EPA has extensive records of materials that have been grown in the United States, so farmers keep extensive records of all of these processes. So you want to make sure and use those to your advantage to see what pesticides you should be screening for. Currently, the USP has a list of, I believe it's, I think it's 72 now for the pesticides in the USP. This has changed a couple of times in the last few years, but contract labs have that specialize in pesticide testing have screens for 300, and now I know there's even a screen for 500. So if you know nothing about the pesticides that would be present, and it's coming from a foreign country, particularly like a China or a South America, where their standards for pesticides have been weaker over the last 20 years, these are things where you may want to do one of these big screens and make sure that there's nothing of concern in those materials. Residual solvents, I mentioned, these are coming typically from extracts of raw materials, botanical extracts, when they're during that extraction process, depending on what that extract is. So there is sort of a general screen for residual solvents you can do, but the more knowledge you know about your raw materials, you may only have to screen for one particular solvent. Melamine, this is the what I mentioned about the mimicking the protein content, and the incidence is in China and here in the United States in cats and dogs. This is the guidance that came out after that in 2009. It's the guidance for industry. It is pharmaceutical components at risk for melamine contamination. Even though this is a pharmaceutical guidance, I think we mentioned this last week, it will apply if you have some of those ingredients on there. And there are a number of dietary ingredients that are used in dietary supplement formulations that are on this list. And what they did is establish a level of less than 2.5 ppm to indicate that the material is not contaminated. So you have to make sure that the method that you're using is below that level. Gluten, celiac disease is where gluten, the whole saga with gluten began. So it's an inflammatory reaction to the gluten protein, which is the gliadin. But less than 1% of the population actually have celiac disease in the United States. But it really has become a fad diet. So most dietary supplement companies have an entirely gluten-free line. So as that, we need to be testing for that. So the means with which to do that is called ELISA. That's an enzyme linked in immunosorbent assay. So ELISA is much easier to say. The colorimetric and titration type analyses on a 96 well plate. Other allergens, products formulated with raw materials containing allergens, and there are many of those, you have to have appropriate cleaning procedures and verifying that that is being removed during their cleaning process to ensure that you don't have cross-contamination. In 21 CFR 117, there's a big discussion about that. Cross-contamination of allergens is repeated over and over and over in that particular regulation. Now, we are exempt from that regulation, but as a classification of foods, we need to be aware of the importance of the allergen. So allergens are certainly classified as a contaminant, so they're also covered in 111. One of the most overarching ways to do this is to do ATP testing. So that's the adenosine triphosphate. So this picks up anything that's found in living cells. That's what ATP is. So that'll pick up a lot of those allergens, not necessarily all. So there are special test kits for different allergens, the different allergenic proteins. For wheat is one of them. Of course, there's one for soy. There's one for nuts. So you can get these to make sure that you've removed that during your manufacturing process from your equipment and contact surfaces. So we have all these specifications and testing that we're going to do. So obviously we have to document that. In a GMP world, if we didn't document, it didn't happen. So we're going to have a combination of a specification and evaluation form. That is the most convenient way to do that. I showed you kind of a quick example earlier in the presentation. So we're going to have this specification evaluation report form. This will limit the redundancy of having two forms that basically have the same information. When you do that, it's inevitable that one form will rev and the other one won't, and then you have contrasting documents. So it can also have additional information on them about the receipt and inspection and the sampling of a material if you're talking about a raw material. It can also have the supplier information and even the supplier qualification status. So here's an example of a raw material specification report form that you can use. So again, we have the 411 up top about what the raw material is, its code, and the documentation number of this form. This is a controlled document, remember. So this will have receipt information, inspection information, the sampling, and it would have the vendor qualification and their status here. And then we just have the first part, the part in the white on the left. We saw that last time. So these are the 5 categories of identity, purity, strength, composition, and contaminant. And we have our test, the specification, and the test method, the specific test method that's being used. And then this part that's slightly grayed out, that's what we would fill in. So the control document, this is the control document with all of this stuff here. And then the gray is what we would fill in when we receive a particular unique lot of material coming in. And then we would do all of this testing. And of course, after that, this is reviewed and approved by the quality unit. Given that it is a control document, you would also have revision history on this. This is nice to say that we added this or we changed this specification. Great tools to do that. All right, so now we're going to move on to material control for components, packaging, and labels with Bob.
Well, hello, everyone. We'll just pick up from where Tara left off. That talks about what we do when we receive these components, packaging, and labeling that Tara just talked about from the specification standpoint. So, again, as we know from the regulation, all sections of the regulation require that we have written procedures to fulfill the requirements. And again, we have that same requirement here. Now, just a quick note on some of my slides, there's a reference to preamble pages. That is the page numbers from that huge 800 and something page preamble that was published with the 2007 regulation. So you might want to look at those at some point in time for more reference about these things. So it says for components, you must visually examine containers for appropriate content, label, damage, seals, and so on. And in the preamble, it says that you must visually examine the supplier's invoice, guarantee, or certificate to ensure that the components are consistent with what you ordered. So you'll look at your purchase order, your invoice, or whatever you have, and compare that to the incoming materials to make sure they're the right materials. Then it says you must quarantine. You always must quarantine these components until you've collected representative samples. Quality control personnel have reviewed and approved tests and examinations. Now, those would be tests and examinations that you would have done in accordance with the specifications that Tara just suggested. And then quality control personnel approve for use the manufacturing and release from quarantine. We must approve these products by the quality unit in the manufacturing process. Now we're going to see a lot of repetition in this section as well. For instance, in this instance, it says you must identify each unique lot in shipment in a manner that you can trace it. So anything and everything that you receive into your facility, you assign it a unique identifier. And that unique identifier then is included in all of the records of testing, the records of use, inventory use, and things like that. So we can identify every lot of component that we received from the day it comes into the facility to the point we actually put it in a manufactured product. And then it says you have to hold components under conditions that will protect them from contamination, deterioration, and mix-up. That is, if they require special storage conditions, if they have to be refrigerated, if there would be a requirement for certain temperature and humidity conditions, we have to make sure that those conditions in fact do exist, and we've documented those conditions. Now for packaging and labeling that you received. Remember, Tara also talked about the different specifications we have for components, packaging, labeling, in process and finished product. So the regulation as far as receiving goes through each one of those areas separately. So it says again, you must visually examine appropriate label, content, damage, just what we saw earlier. And again, we determine if it's the right material, if it's consistent with the purchase order that we put in for that particular material. Again, you must quarantine all packaging and labeling. Again, same verbiage we've seen before, and you're going to see it several more times before I finish this presentation. But we collect samples, quality control, review and approve any tests and results, and then quality control approve the use and release from quarantine. Now remember again, Tara said for packaging and labeling, the identification, the tests or examination is probably just looking at the incoming packaging and labeling materials versus the master copies that we have in our files for each of those materials. Same thing again, as it says, you must identify each shipment in a manner that you can trace it. That's unique, that unique identifier that we typically use, so that we record that on all incoming documents, test materials, any manufacturing packaging records as well. And then it says again that we have to hold them under appropriate conditions. We must be sure that we do not contaminate the materials or cause deterioration of materials before we actually use them in production. Now for packaging and labeling, that usually isn't very critical, but there may be some exceptions where we have to have special storage conditions even for packaging and labels. So there are some special considerations for labels and labeling. Immediately when you received it, they should be put in a restricted access, preferably locked area. We like to see labels and labeling stored in a locked cage area. And certainly they have to be identified when they come in. We have to put them into a quarantine status. Later on, after quality has reviewed and approved them, the status will change to approved, or sometimes we might have to reject. So all materials must have clear status identification, either by location and physical labeling, or in today's world, most companies have some sort of a computer system that we can quickly and easily identify that the material status, i.e. quarantined, approved, or rejected. So The status of materials is something to keep in mind. It must be obvious at all times. We can't have materials sitting around in the warehouse or in a manufacturing facility and not know whether we can use them, if they're quarantined, or maybe they even were rejected. So that we maintain accurate records of label use and issuance and return. Label reconciliation is a very important part of these activities. Some of it's done by the label room people. A lot of it is also done or documented on the actual packaging and labeling documents, packaging records, labeling records, whatever kind of forms you use in the actual packaging and labeling operations will certainly identify label use, issuance, and reconciliation. Now we move on to product that might be received. So you're receiving bulk material that you had manufactured by some other company, and now you are going to package and label that bulk into finished consumer containers. So again, we see the familiar language that you must visually examine, look for damage, broken seals, deterioration. Again, make sure it is the right product, it is consistent with whatever your purchase order called for, that you did get the right material. Again, we must quarantine until we collect samples, quality control review and approved whatever documentation you've set in place to assure that the specifications have been met, and then quality control approve the product for packaging and release from quarantine. Keep in mind that quality control is always involved in the evaluation of components, materials, and at the end of the day, they are the only ones that can release that material, change the status of that material, and release it for use in production. Again, it talks about the idea that we're going to assign a unique identifier to each shipment. So when these materials come in, we have this identifier again, and that identifier is always on any evaluation, sampling, testing, any packaging or batch records where that's used. We have that unique identifier, so we can trace anything and everything that's used in a finished product back to the original receipt, know who the producer was, what kind of testing evaluation that we did on each and every one of those lots. Again, for product that you receive for packaging and labeling, you must hold the product under conditions protected against contamination, deterioration, and mix-up. Now, in this case, there may well be some instances where you have to have special storage conditions. Maybe the product has to be refrigerated. If that's the case, we have to make sure we have the appropriate refrigerated conditions, monitored refrigerators, and things like that. And to avoid mix-up, most of that is by status identification and adequate space. We don't like to see a very crowded area where these products are being received, managed, and packaged. So spatial separation is always one of the best means to help avoid mix-ups. Now, sometimes we have to reject material, and the regulation says you must identify and hold under quarantine for appropriate disposition or until appropriate disposition is done. Yes, in fact, more than quarantine, we even like to see a special area designated for the storage of reject materials. Again, much like the labels, ideally, this would be a locked caged area, or at least a very specially designated area where we always store rejected materials unless and until we have made a disposition decision about that material. And of course, we know that we must make and keep required records in accordance with this subpart. That is, we have to have SOPs that describe how we're going to do things. We're going to have documentation of the incoming materials, documentation of the sampling, examination, and the quality review, and the final quality acceptance moving it from quarantine into accepted status, or rejected if that were happen to be the case. So written procedures, receiving records, much of the documents I just briefly described are what we know we have to have. Keeping in mind, we always have to, I know Tara mentioned earlier, and I'll say it again, if we didn't document a situation, if we didn't document that we did something, it's just a rumor that it even was done. So GMPs are all about documentation, documentation, documentation. And another point that I know we made last week, but we'll make it again, at this documentation done by the person who performed the required activities at the time of performance, not sometime later, not minutes later, not tomorrow, not this afternoon, but they record whatever activities they're required to record at the time they do that activity. And of course, the documentation has to include the date. Dates are certainly important. Initials or signatures of the people that actually did the work. If problems come up later with a particular receipt, product, or problem, we always need to know who were the people involved, because part of our investigation may well be talking to those people to see what they remember about the particular incident at hand. And of course, the records include any results of any testing or examination. Again, if you used forms like Tara showed earlier, you have a form that drives you to fill out the boxes on that form. Test and examination information are going to be in there. And then if we had any material reviews, which is another subject, a material review is just an investigation of a problem, for instance, a failed specification or something like that. If we did an investigation of a rejected material, we'd have all that documentation as well, and the final disposition of the particular material or product in question. Citations concerning this particular area. First one we mentioned is some company failed to establish and follow written procedures for packaging and labeling operations. This is a pretty common 483 and warning letter observation. Companies just do not have procedures, SOPs, or their procedures are judged to be inadequate. Another one then is some company failed to establish specifications for the dietary supplement labels and packaging. Again, remember that specification in this case is all likelihood just a master copy of the label or labeling you use to compare against incoming shipments of those materials. In this instance, a company somewhere did not have those specifications. Okay, so that finishes that segment. We'll move on to the next one, which is in this case, it's subpart M and N on the subjects of holding and distribution. Subpart M specifically deals with your responsibilities for holding and distributing dietary supplement products. Now, there's a opening slide here just to point out that even distribution centers, wholesalers, people that don't even manufacture product, but simply get in finished product for distribution, they are subject to a number of the parts of the GMP. In this case, the two we're going to talk about today, distribution part, and then the returned dietary supplement part. So just as a quick example, so we're talking about a product, in this case, a probiotic that requires refrigeration. And I mentioned earlier that we have to store materials under appropriate conditions. Now, the regulation specifically says in this section of subpart D that if you have refrigerated storage conditions, then those refrigerators must be equipped with indicating thermometers, temperature measuring devices, or temperature recording devices. Somehow or another, we can accurately track and document what the storage conditions were over time for the products that we're storing. They also says that they must be automatically regulated. So typically we have temperature monitoring devices in refrigerated areas, and if they go out of the ranges that are acceptable, some sort of alarm is sounded and management has an opportunity to react to that out of specification situation. So again, with all of these sections, we must have written procedures for fulfilling the requirements. There are just more SOPs, and we know that virtually all sections of this regulation now, we must have SOPs that detail how we're going to comply with those requirements. So in the holding area, it goes on to say that components and dietary supplements must be held under appropriate conditions of temperature, humidity, light, and so on. Sure that we do not cause deterioration of these materials because of the storage conditions that we hold them under. So it points out that this applies to the physical plant. In the plant where we're manufacturing, we may have in-process materials, we may have finished materials, whatever it may be. Anywhere we're holding components or dietary supplements, we have to make sure that the storage conditions are appropriate. There is one exception that's noted, that the retail establishments are exempt from this condition. However, most states and local jurisdictions do have some requirements that would address what the requirements might have to be for the retail storage. Also says to meet this requirement, the area where dietary supplements are held should be environmentally controlled. Yes, usually we have temperature and humidity controlled conditions, and we also monitor them as stated above for refrigerators particularly, but really for all storage areas. And we also typically do what's called temperature humidity mapping of those areas so that we can document that the conditions throughout the warehouse from the very top to the bottom shelves are all within whatever our specifications are. It goes on to say that packaging and labeling must be held under appropriate conditions, as well as components under appropriate conditions. We've seen this language again and again, and I don't think I need to belabor the point, but we understand that whatever the storage conditions are for those particular materials, we must make sure that our storage conditions meet that criteria. Now, just a little bit on some EAS guidance in this arena. Certainly, you must have sufficient space. I think one of the more common situations that Tara and I have seen in dietary supplement audits is that the facilities are just overcrowded. Many of you have a very good business, I believe, and as a result, you don't have enough space to store all the materials that you must have, raw materials and otherwise. So overcrowding is a very, very common problem in the audits that we have made. And of course, it's common sense that these areas must be clean and orderly. We can't have any pests, insects, rodents, or otherwise anywhere in these facilities. And of course, typically a company has a pest control contractor that services, and we always examine those kind of documents to see if there's any evidence of pests and otherwise. And then there's the issue of wooden pellets. Now, I don't know of anything in FDA guidance that says you cannot use wooden pellets, but we certainly know that there are some hazards, some potential problems using wooden pellets, because we have seen E. coli and Listeria contamination coming from these pellets. Now, there are some high temperature treated wooden pellets that are better than others, but our recommendation that for sure in the manufacturing area, you would avoid taking wooden pellets into the manufacturing area, and to the extent you can, have a program where you're getting away from using wooden pellets completely. And then, of course, Tara touched on the topic of allergen programs. Allergen days, so you certainly must have an allergen control program, or when you bring allergens into your warehouse, you probably have a designated area for storage of those materials. You don't store an allergen product on a high shelf above a non-allergen product, such that if that allergen product bag were broken or damaged, it would spill on the non-allergen material below it. So we must have an allergen product, not only just in the warehouse, but throughout the manufacturing and packaging operations. We've already touched on the idea that certainly materials must be properly identified concerning their status at all times. So you've seen now that when anything and everything that comes into the facility, it is initially quarantined. Eventually, hopefully it's released, but sometimes it's rejected. So these materials are at all times identified concerning their status, either by labeling and location, or, as I suggested earlier, possibly through a computer control system that can give us the status identification for all materials. So we have them identified at all times. We know what they are. We know what the item number is. We know, remember, we had that unique identifier we assigned when these materials come in, so we can quickly and easily determine what the product is from these various number identifiers and from the labeling or the computer system as to material status. Common sense storage, yes, and good warehousing practices. We don't store products directly on the wall, or directly on the floor or close to the wall. We must have space behind materials, about 10 to 12 inches, so you can do adequate inspection for any possible contamination that could be occurring in a warehouse. Now, it also talks about in-process materials. No different than what we talked about in all these other materials. They must be identified, held under appropriate conditions of storage. I mean, in-process materials could be your powder mix before you send it to the tableting machine, to the capsule fillers, any and all in-process materials that we have in the facility. We have to make sure we properly store them, we properly identify them, and again, it mentions specifically if there's special temperature, humidity, or light requirements that we have to make sure that exists. One little note here at the bottom of this slide is there's no requirements to maintain in-process reserve samples. But we're going to talk next about the subject of reserve samples, because finished products, as we'll find in a few minutes, we do have to have reserve samples. So the regulation talks about how you must hold these reserve samples. These are very, very important samples. Must hold them under conditions so we know they did not deteriorate. We're going to have them in the same container closure system as it's packaged and labeled to the consumer, so that these samples represent what the product was like when we manufactured it and what it's like now after it's been stored, maybe for some time. Understand that if we have complaint investigations, many times it's very important to see if anything is happening there in the reserve sample compared to what the complainant might allege about the product. So these are terribly important samples to have, so you must make sure that they are properly stored and secured. Again, this section doesn't say that you put them in a restricted area, but we recommend that reserve samples placed again in some sort of a secured area, preferably in a locked cage area, so that we have limited access at least to preserve them. Now, we do suggest that although there are no requirements to hold reserve samples of components, we believe that reserve samples of components could be very important in any investigations that you may have to conduct. So if you don't now collect reserve samples of components, you may want to think about it, because they could have great value in any investigations you might have to make. Also keep in mind that bulk packaging is also a container closure system. If you just manufacture products and ship them out in bulk, that is the package that you ship the product to the customer in. So we must try to duplicate that bulk container as much as we can for the reserve samples that we maintain of the finished product. So typically we just have a smaller package that looks very similar to the big bulk package that we send out, that we hold as our reserve sample for that finished product. Now, the specific sections in the regulation about reserve samples are found at these parts. Basically, it states that you must keep that date if you have a shelf life date, and dietary supplements don't always have a shelf life date. So the next criteria would be 2 years from the date of distribution of the last batch of that particular supplement. So you have to keep this in mind when you set up your reserve sample collection and retaining requirements. 1 year, 2 year, depending on whether or not you have expiration date or you don't. Now, this regulation does not say how much you want to keep. Typically, companies will keep at least twice the amount that's necessary to do all of the finished product testing. However, it's not uncommon that companies keep considerably more than that. So you will decide how much you will keep, but this regulation clearly tells you how long you must keep them. Now we move on to discussion of some distribution. Again, it says that distribution must be done under conditions to protect the supplement. So again, if this is a refrigerated product had to be kept under refrigeration, you're going to have to take that into consideration. You're going to have to think about what carriers you could use that could provide the appropriate storage conditions if they're not your own vehicles. So obviously, for a product that has to be refrigerated, we're going to have a refrigerated delivery vehicle. Usually companies will also put in a pre-programmed data logger with refrigerated shipments so that we can document what the shipment conditions were from the time they left your facility until they got to the customer. And of course, we need to make sure that these transport vehicles are clean, appropriate, before we put our product into them, both the products going out, and well, I don't think I mentioned it, the products coming in. Part of that inspection process is to make sure that these vehicles are clean. Just like in all these sections, we have to keep records, and we certainly know that by now. It says you must make and keep records of written procedures for holding and distribution operations. So yes, you're going to have SOPs that describe how you're going to set up and monitor your holding and distribution activities. And of course, you have to have records of product distribution. Recalls happen, unfortunately, so we have to make sure we have distribution records where we can quickly and easily determine all of the distribution of a particular lot of product. Now, here's some guidance materials. Again, as Tara mentioned a couple of guidances earlier, most of these guidances were designed for the drug community, or even in this case, the prescription drug community. But we think there are some very good suggestions and principles in these documents that you might want to look at, particularly concerning with counterfeiting, things like that. we have seen counterfeiting even in the dietary supplement arena. So you may well want to take a look at these guidance materials if you haven't already done so. Here's another one from USP in the supply chain integrity aspect. There are some very good suggestions in this as well. Some of the supplier qualification programs we'll talk about a bit later in the next segment, as well as the quality agreements. But you may get involved in some of these with some of the people that actually distribute, ship your products for you. Now, there have been warning letter citations in this area as well. In this case, some company did not identify each unique lot with each unique shipment of packaging in a manner that allowed it to be traced. Remember, we said in each of those sections we talked about earlier, you must assign this unique identifier, whether it's components, it's packaging and labeling, so that we can track and trace all of these items. All of the materials, we're going to have this unique identifier, remember? That's recorded on all incoming documents. It's also going to be recorded on all packaging labeling documents, batch records. So somebody somewhere didn't even assign this unique identifier. So presumably they could not track each and every lot of materials that they received. Now, this company also, or some other company, didn't have written procedures for holding materials, raw materials, finished product, retained samples, finished product. So assuming that they didn't have the necessary SOPs that we just looked at a few minutes ago that you must have. So they did not establish written procedures for controlling and monitoring temperature. Yes, I mentioned that we must do that. We should do this temperature mapping. We should have an SOP for how we do temperature mapping, and we should in fact document that it's been done, and we have shown that appropriate temperature humidity conditions do exist in any and all storage areas. Separate or defined area of adequate size. Overcrowding. We've seen that repeatedly, as I mentioned earlier. Somebody's written procedures for holding a distribution operations provide your firm will hold finished product in storage area under appropriate conditions. But your firm was not able to show that such procedures were followed. So just guessing, they probably didn't have documentation of the actual storage conditions through these temperature recorders or whatever other means they would have to show that the appropriate temperature humidity really did exist. In this case, some company didn't hold dietary supplements under conditions that would not lead to mix-up, okay? We had storage of non-production toxic materials, apparently close to raw materials. We need to keep any and all toxic materials, cleaners and things like that in some separate area away from materials that we're going to actually use in production. They had some unlabeled materials stored in the facility. Presumably, we don't know what the status of those materials were if they weren't labeled. Had storage of various unlabeled liquid containers, bottles. I've seen that. Tara's seen that. I know. We see bottles of a liquid, no label on the material at all. We don't know what it is, why it's there. In your finished product warehouse, pallets of whey protein containers and closures were not labeled for identity disposition. Again, this company appears to have a pretty lax storage condition, lacking identification of material status and commingling toxic materials and otherwise with those materials. All right, so I have one more session. We will jump in here in a minute. And it's on the subject of own label distributors. So we'll move on into that section next. So we know that the dietary supplement industry is really an industry of contracting. Dietary supplement companies have contract manufacturers for their finished products. They have contract packagers who actually package and label products for them. They often use contract laboratories, and sometimes they even use contract distribution warehouses to store and distribute their products. Now, our definition of an own label distributor is a product brand owner that contracts with other firms to manufacture, package, or label the product on their behalf for distribution to the consumer. So regardless of where the operations take place, FDA has made it very clear that own label distributors are responsible for compliance with the regulation, particularly the Part 111, Good Manufacturing Practices for Dietary Supplements, and Food Labeling. Typical warning letters we have seen and continue to see to dietary supplement distributors have verbiage such as this. It says, to the extent that you contract with other firms to manufacture, package, and label product on your behalf that your firm releases for distribution under your firm's name. Remember, your name, your company's name appears on this label. So you are responsible for that product. So your firm has an obligation to know what and how the manufacturing, packaging, and labeling activities are performed so that you can make decisions related to whether your dietary supplement product conforms to specifications, whether to approve or release the product. Further, these warning letters always say that although a firm may contract out certain dietary supplement manufacturing, packaging, or labeling operation, it cannot contract out its ultimate responsibility to ensure that the dietary supplement put in commerce is not adulterated. That's the key part to these warning letter citations. Even though somebody else makes the product for you, packages the product for you, you still have the obligation to know that those activities were performed in accordance with good manufacturing practice requirements. Finally, these warning letters say that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act prohibits a person from introducing or delivering or causing delivery into interstate commerce a dietary supplement that is adulterated under Section 402G. And that is just the GMP section of the 21 CFR Part 111. The adulteration is just the charge, the legal charge that's made if FDA charges that a dietary supplement was not manufactured in accordance with those regulation requirements. So, any firm then that contracts out some or all of these operations must establish a system of production process controls to ensure the quality of that dietary supplement. That is, they have to have a GMP system, even if they're just a distributor. So their quality system will at least include these parts, which we will discuss a bit more detail in subsequent slides. You got to have finished product specifications. You're going to have a contract manufacturer qualification program. That program is going to look at master batch records and batch production records, among other things. Your own label distributor is going to have a quality unit responsibilities. You're going to have quality agreements with these people. You're going to have product complaint procedures. such as I discussed last week in our presentation on the handling and management investigation of complaints. And finally, you're going to have a change control process to make sure that any and all changes made to your quality system are properly evaluated and approved by quality before those changes are made. So again, the own label distributor will have to establish finished product specification for all of the dietary supplement products that you're going to have manufactured, packaged, labeled, or tested. Now, sometimes this is an activity that's done between the own label distributor and the contract manufacturer, but the own label distributor must have those established specifications, review and approve those specifications for all their products. Again, those products were manufactured, shipped, and sold under your company name. So keep in mind that you are responsible for that product. Then just like for testing materials under the specification aspects Tara touched on earlier, you have written procedures to explain why meeting these specifications will ensure that the product meets all those 5 things: the identity, purity, strength, composition, and potential contaminants. And of course, you're going to have a finished product specification, SOP, that describes how you're going to establish those specifications. Now, you must have qualified contract manufacturers and laboratories as well. So in order to do that, you need to make sure, of course, that those facilities are properly registered. If they're a foreign firm, there needs to be a U.S. agent involved for that foreign company. You must verify compliance with GMPs at that manufacturer. Again, keep in mind we're talking about manufacturer or laboratory. You have to verify that their quality system is in compliance with the GMPs for dietary supplements. This usually starts with a questionnaire that we send to companies we are considering as contract manufacturers, a questionnaire about their quality system, generally about their regulatory history, maybe certifications, things like that. If we evaluate that questionnaire and that contractor seems to be appropriate for our needs, then we will follow that up with an on-site audit. Those are the kind of things that Tara and I often do for companies, but we go to that manufacturer, laboratory, actually do a GMP audit of their facility, verify that in fact they do have GMP system, a quality system in place that complies with the regulation. And then of course there's continual monitoring of the manufacturing compliance. Most companies will review at least periodically all the master manufacturing records for the products that they have manufactured. They may review every batch record for each lot of product that they receive along with the certificates of analysis, or they may review all of them for some period of time and then decide that they'll do every 3rd lot, 5th lot, or some scheme such as that. But all of this again will be described in this SOP as just how you're going to qualify and continually monitor all of your contract manufacturers. You must have a quality unit. As an own-label distributor, you must have a quality unit. And that quality unit will be responsible for all of these things, just as if it was in a manufacturing facility. Quality must review and approve or reject just about all documents, procedures. Again, you will, at least in conjunction with the contract manufacturer, develop your master batch records, your packaging records, batch records, and all things associated with the production of that material. So there will be a joint effort in some of this, but quality in the end must review and approve all of these activities. And of course, there has to be an SOP that describes the responsibilities of the quality unit. Now, it's not an absolute requirement in the FDA regulations that you have quality agreements, but we at EAS believe you should never enter into a contract manufacturing or a contract laboratory agreement without a quality agreement. What a quality agreement basically does, it assigns various responsibilities to either the contractor or the own label distributor, or in some cases, both. So we assign responsibility for generation of data to support expiration dating, for instance. If your product has a best by date or an expiration date, of course, there must be a stability program, and you must do testing to verify that that product will the expiry period that we put on the label. Now, sometimes that's done by the contract manufacturer. Sometimes it's done by the label owner, own label distributor. At any rate, it has to be clearly defined in the quality agreement who's going to be responsible for such things as a stability program. We also want to make sure in the quality agreement that we are informed of any FDA inspections, any 483s, observations, or of course, any warning letters. We definitely want to know what's going on with that company. If they have any regulatory issues, it could impact our decision to continue to use them as a contractor. So we really are in a partnership with that contract manufacturer, but our product, our label is at risk if that contract manufacturer has any regulatory issues. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, you must have a product complaint procedure. You must have an SOP consistent with some of the principles I discussed last week. And just to summarize them very briefly, we must have a qualified person who reviews all these complaints, okay? The qualified person must review these complaints, decide if there's going to be an investigation necessary, screen these for any illness or injury possibilities, because if there is, then we have to jump into the adverse event reporting mode. And of course, quality must review and approve all the decisions about that investigation, about the findings, the follow-up, and whatever final decision we're going to make about that complaint. Now, as I mentioned, if those complaints should show that there was an adverse event, somebody got sick or ill or went to the hospital emergency room or otherwise because of using one of our products, then we get into an area that's called adverse event reporting, or in this case, serious adverse event reporting, because as I explained last week, there are adverse events that we have to monitor, but if they reach a level of serious adverse events, which is subject to a different set of criteria, then we must report that information to FDA through this MedWatch Form 3500A. And that has a very strict reporting time frame of 15 days from when we first learn of that report. And then, of course, we must maintain any and all records associated with a serious adverse event for up to 6 years, which is probably longer than you typically maintain most all of your records. And then we must have a change control procedure, okay? Revision control is certainly critical for SOPs. If we don't have a mechanism for managing changes to a quality system, pretty soon that system may no longer be in compliance. So all changes have to be tracked and monitored. We have to refer to all forms, checklists, because sometimes we get a SOP revise, we forget about the forms and checklists, so we just have to monitor all of those documents, because remember, the SOPs are really the framework of our quality system. And we must make sure that all revisions are monitored, tracked, reviewed, and approved by quality before they're changed. So we're going to have a change control SOP. Now, it's surprising, there is no specific reference to change control in the dietary supplement GMP. However, it does say that QC must perform, including approving, rejecting all processes, specs, written procedures, control, tests, examinations, deviations from, or modifications to them. So that's changes. So it's very clear that we must have a change control procedure. But anybody that's familiar with quality systems know that this would be essential regardless of what the GMP said about it. Now, there is some mention of automatic, mechanical, electronic, and this gets into the electronic computer systems that are certainly in place in a lot of areas today. That gets into some higher level discussion about Part 11, electronic records and electronic documents, that we are not going to cover in today's presentation. And that finishes my presentations for today.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, Lord.
We can.
You got me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, let me minimize this. And now I'm all the way at the front of my slides for some reason. Where do I need to be, 160?
Yes. 106.
Oops, sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about managing an FDA inspection, which I am sure everybody who has been through one knows exactly how much fun having FDA in your facility is. And it's really not supposed to be fun, but if you're doing everything, or even just about everything we've talked about the last couple of days, and you're prepared for when FDA arrives, and your staff knows what to do, and you know what to do, while it's not going to be fun, having FDA in your facility should not be a cause for panic. It will be probably disruptive, but it should not be any kind of insurmountable or potentially disastrous challenge for your company. So when I spoke last week, we talked about the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and in that act, and that's the act that governs everything we do, the FDCA specifically authorizes FDA to enter and inspect at reasonable times. I'll speak about that in a second, within reasonable limits and in a reasonable manner, any factory, warehouse, establishment, vehicle, equipment, plants and storage facilities, finished and unfinished materials, containers, labeling, and specifically states that they are allowed to take samples of your materials, in-process materials, finished products, labels, labeling, catalogs if they're on the property where they are inspecting. In essence, whatever the agency needs to do to achieve the objective of the inspection, which is generally to make sure you're complying with the FDC Act, and in particular with the GMPs, with Part 111. It's important to keep in mind that when the law says reasonable times, reasonable limits in a reasonable manner. What that means, and FDA has asserted this, it's been affirmed by the courts, reasonable times, anytime your facility is operating. If your facility is open, FDA has the authority to come in. It doesn't matter if the company president, company vice president, and company director of quality are all on vacation at the same time. The premise being, if there's somebody on site with sufficient authority to make sure that the facility is operating the way it should operate, then that person should have a sufficient authority to deal with FDA and handle an inspection. When we talk about potential unreasonable times, that means if your facility normally closes at 5 p.m., FDA can't show up at 4:59 and announce it's there to do an inspection. That's not reasonable. But if your facility is operating three 8-hour shifts and is open around the clock, if FDA arrives at 2 in the morning and you're operating, they have authority to come in and conduct an inspection. The FDCA gives the agency access to certain records, specifically records designed or that will allow them to prove interstate commerce. Some records required under the Bioterror Act, and some records identified in specific regulations. For example, low-acid canned foods. That regulation allows FDA some access to some specific records. And regulations that, for example, Bob just spoke about regarding adverse event reporting. And you're responsible for understanding what your record retention, required record retention period is, and having the appropriate policies and procedures in place. However, when FDA comes in and asks for access to records, the law specifically says the agency is not entitled to your financial data, your sales data other than information relating to shipment, and that goes to the interstate commerce issue, because FDA needs to, or actually FDA only has jurisdiction over a product that involves interstate commerce. And that just doesn't mean that that's much broader than if your facility is in New York, you only sell to people in New York. You still haven't escaped the interstate commerce requirement unless you can show that everything that goes into the product you're making comes from New York, and there's absolutely nothing from out of state. FDA can't get sales, as I said, sales data, pricing data. They're not allowed to look at personnel records other than as needed to ensure qualification for a job tasks. And we've talked about training records and the necessity to keep them. And there's certain narrow categories of research data FDA is permitted to have access to. As I alluded to before, FDA is not required to pre-announce its inspection. The agency almost never, in a domestic setting, calls in advance and will alert you that it's coming in for an inspection. The investigators will show up at your facility, announce that they are there to conduct an inspection, serve whoever is greeting them with a notice of inspection, and then proceed to do their thing. This is a little bit different outside of the U.S., where the inspections are generally conducted with the agreement and the participation at some level of the local regulatory authorities. But in those cases, FDA will almost always, it's actually the opposite situation. FDA will almost always call in advance, sometimes months in advance, and schedule a date for an inspection. And in part, that's due to potential cultural issues, potential issues relating to cost of travel. FDA doesn't want to be in a situation where it flies two investigators to Hong Kong only to discover that a facility is closed for a month. That would kind of waste a lot of taxpayer money, a lot of money the agency really doesn't have these days. The exception being, and this is more on the drug side, pre-approval, pre-license inspections, and my experience is that, again, almost all foreign inspections FDA will call in advance. And again, there's specific reasons for that enumerated here in this slide. There's a new section in the Act. It's relatively new. That was designed to increase FDA's authority and to deal with some situations where inspections had been restricted. And it specifically, and Bob spoke about this concept earlier. I mentioned it at the beginning of our first day, but a drug is adulterated if it's been manufactured, processed, packaged, or held in any factory, warehouse, or establishment, and the owner, operator, or agent of the facility delays, denies, or limits an inspection. We believe that this principle is almost certainly applicable to dietary supplements and other FDA regulated industries. There's a specific discussion of this authority, excuse me, and the reasons behind it in the guidance document issued in October of 2014, specifically discussing what constitutes delaying, denying, limiting, or refusing an inspection. So you'll see some examples here, and in some cases, and this is more again applicable to the specific enumerated instances and foreign inspections, but the facility doesn't agree to a proposed inspection date unless there's a real justification. Not allowing access to an area of a facility until some future date is considered a delay. Locking investigators in a conference room without necessary access to necessary documents, or responsible individuals for an unreasonable amount of time that interferes with the investigator's ability to complete an inspection. You know, and we'll talk about in a little bit the concept of having a room for FDA to set itself up and for the investigators to look at documents, but that does not mean putting them in a conference room without access to anything and telling them just to sit there. FDA requests to records, but the facility fails to produce them in a timely manner without a reasonable explanation. And that, for example, can be if you are an own-label distributor, and Bob touched on this, you're supposed to have certain records. Those records may actually be in the possession of your contract manufacturer. FDA generally allows 24, maybe 48 hours for you to produce documents, for example, a complete batch production record that the contract manufacturer is holding. So if FDA, the investigator, asks for this kind of document, the response that my contract manufacturer has this, I need 24 hours to get it electronically from them, is perfectly acceptable. The response, my contract manufacturer has these documents, they're located in Hong Kong, you need to go there to get them, is not an acceptable response in these circumstances. Denials of inspections, and Bob, Tara, and I have seen all of these. Upon arrival at the facility, the company doesn't allow the investigator in. Facility sends staff home for the day and then announces, well, we're not producing anything, so there's nothing for you to see here. Or requires FDA to begin the inspection, or to wait to begin the inspection because certain staff members are not present without any kind of reasonable justification for this delay. And that goes to the point that if your facility is operating, FDA asserts that it has the authority to conduct the inspection, because if there's somebody with authority or sufficient responsibility to supervise your facility being operational, then whoever that person is has to have sufficient authority to deal with the agency. Limiting inspections, and we've all seen these. Discontinuing manufacturing during the duration of the inspection. The facility says, we'll let you in and you can be on the manufacturing floor, you can walk around, but you've got 30 minutes. You then have to leave. Restricting entry to a particular portion of the facility. Locking doors, closing loading bay. Interesting subject, we'll talk about that in a little bit. There is a dispute between industry and the agency on this, but FDA's position is if you don't allow photography, if the investigator thinks photos are necessary, you're limiting FDA's ability to properly conduct its work. Refusal to allow review shipping records, partial production of records, or in any way declining or impeding FDA's ability to collect samples, that including in-process materials, reserve materials, or even telling FDA that you have an issue with them taking environmental swabs. So these are all the kinds of things that are guaranteed, with the exception of photography, but they're a guaranteed ticket to trouble. Some real life examples that we've seen. Again, not unlocking doors, just telling the agents, telling the investigator, you cannot go in there. We're just failing to respond to FDA's attempt to contact designated personnel and schedule an inspection when it's necessary for the agency to do so. The last one is real. We've seen this. The facility does not answer calls from the investigator who's present at the facility, despite evidence of the presence of employees engaged in job-related functions. I've had a situation like this where I have gotten calls from a district director asking me why my client is not allowing a reinspection of its facility. The investigators were outside, no one was answering the door, even though the parking lot was full and there was obvious activity inside the building. These kinds of things really do go on. One interesting thing about FDA is it's actually fairly transparent. Sometimes it's very hard to get information out of, but in some areas it's very, very transparent. So the agency has something called the Investigations Operations Manual, IOM. Bob probably had this memorized at some point. The URL displayed on this slide, if you click on it, you get access to the IOM. And what it is the how-to guide used to train investigators on what FDA wants done during an inspection. There have been some recent updates there. Food Safety Modernization Act, reinspection user fees are now covered. There's some issues discussed regarding in-plant photographs, which is a hot button issue, which in the IOM, it tells the investigators not to request permission from management to take photographs during an inspection. Just go in, take pictures as you deem necessary. We advise all of our clients not to permit photographs because they're not specifically allowed in the enumerated powers in the FDCA. And the IOM goes on to tell the investigator that if management objects, explain that photographs are essential to your ability to conduct the investigation. And the agency has a little piece of paper, a single sheet of paper that talks about the two cases mentioned in these slides and says, look, we've got these cases and the courts have specifically told us we're allowed to take photographs. The problem being is the Dow Chemical case deals with a situation where the EPA went out and rented a helicopter and took pictures in the open air of a field looking for some source of contamination, found it, and recorded what it found with photographs from the helicopter. And the second case involves the food industry, but it was uncontested. The company defaulted. The court never actually ruled on the merits of any argument regarding photographs. So when my clients are presented with this kind of situation, I generally ask to be allowed to speak to the investigator, and the investigator inevitably talks about these cases to me. And my response, equally inevitably, is, well, that wholesale grocery company case, that was uncontested and it was in Iowa. So maybe that case means in Iowa you can take pictures during an inspection. The Supreme Court case says it's okay for a federal agency to get in a helicopter and take pictures of an open field where there's no expectation. I've actually made the next statement to an investigator. So that means if you want to go across the field to Republic Airport, rent a helicopter, and take pictures of the roof of my client's warehouse, there's absolutely nothing I can do to stop you. But we do not permit any photographic equipment, any pictures in our facility. And my experience to date has been there will be some pushback, but inevitably the agency opts not to take the pictures. And we've also found that in some cases, FDA's Office of General Counsel will attempt to make contact and persuade whoever is representing the company being inspected to allow photographs. But they really only do that in instances where they don't know the lawyer, the counsel who's involved in the case. Uniformly, when the attorneys at FDA are told about these situations and they know that the attorney involved in the matter understands agency procedure and what's going on, 100% of the time, the photography issue goes by the boards without it being a concern to the client. And it's important to understand why FDA wants to take photos when we think about this. When we say to ourselves, do we really want to fight with FDA? Well, the Investigations Operations Manual, the IOM, tells the investigator that photos are needed. They're a really great tool, and I assure you, it's not to take pictures of evidence of what a great facility you are running. What they're looking to do is take pictures of evidence of any of these 5 items and more: rodents or insects, faulty construction, inadequate maintenance, poor raw material or product storage conditions, labels or labeling that have issues with them, visual contamination. It's evidence to support an enforcement action. And yes, we all understand the investigator can make written records of what they're observing. But in many of these instances, a picture really is worth 1,000 words, which is why generally when I speak to my clients, I talk about defending an inspection. FDA is there, they do have a job to do, but the job is to make sure that you're not violating the act. And if you are, to do what it can to document it. And my job is to position my clients in the best way possible to prevent that from happening. So there's some administrative requirements set out, some things that have to happen during the course of an inspection. The first one being FDA has to serve you with a notice of inspection when it arrives. That involves the investigator coming in, giving you the piece of paper that says we're here to inspect, showing you their identification, which usually also includes a shield, a badge. Other forms required are 483, a report of inspectional observations. We've heard the end of the inspection. Obviously, the notice of inspection is issued at the beginning. And the FDA 484, it's a receipt for samples. So when FDA takes anything out of your facility, raw material, finished product, labels, catalogs, the investigators are required to give you a receipt for those. And in fact, you're permitted to charge FDA for material it takes from your facility. We generally advise not to charge the agency for routine samples it's taking, and the only time it's really worth even thinking about doing that if there is some ridiculously expensive product or material the agency is taking a lot of. Well, then it might be something you have no choice about other than to issue an invoice to the agency, but as a general proposition, we don't consider that great practice. So there's some things that you need to understand your employees should be trained to do. We've talked a lot in our 2 sessions about SOPs, standard operating procedures. We all advise that it's a really good idea to have an SOP on handling inspections for your employees. It helps employees understand what to do when FDA is there and why they need to be doing all the things on this slide. So they should be supporting your company in its preparation efforts for whenever FDA might walk in. It means ensuring that their work areas are orderly. Equipment and instruments are clean and calibrated. Logs and records are accurately filled out. Your employees should be doing this both to ensure that GMPs are being complied with, that you're producing a quality product, and to be prepared for when FDA comes in to do its inspection. It's very important that employees understand that they have to answer questions honestly, directly, and to say, I don't know, if they really don't know. There's a part of the Federal Criminal Code, which is Title 18, it's called Section 1001, that makes it a felony to mislead, lie, omit material facts to any federal employee who is trying to get information in the course of conducting their official duties. And that applies to an FDA investigator. So lying about doing a batch production record, lying about a signature, lying about dates tests were performed, are all potential felonies. Falsifying batch production records or any document in your facility. Again, you're producing information potentially in those records to an agent of the federal government, and to falsify that information, again, creates a potential felony. The answer, I don't know, or I just didn't do it, or I'm not comfortable answering that question, is always 100% of the time preferable to making up an answer, lying, or misleading. Employees should understand that they should be professional, courteous, and cooperative. You'll be surprised if you're professional, courteous, and cooperative to the investigator 99.9% of the time, that behavior will be returned. They will be professional, courteous, and cooperative. They're there to do a job. They want to do their job. Their objective in coming in to your facility is not to hassle you, it's to do their job. Employees should understand their job tasks, how to describe them, the products they're working on, the procedures that they're supposed to do, and how to operate the equipment and instruments that they utilize. The investigator is permitted to ask an employee, describe your job tasks, show me how you operate this piece of equipment. They're not entitled to take the employee into a side room without company representatives present and ask them whatever they want, but they are permitted to ask in the presence of company representatives questions like those areas, explore those areas to ensure the employee is capable of performing his or her job in order to ensure compliance with the GMPs. Employees should understand, don't volunteer information, don't guess for obvious reasons relating to what I just discussed, don't provide misinformation, don't mislead, don't be confrontational or argumentative. Fighting, employees arguing, being rude, confrontation, key to draw out the inspection and make it a much less or much more unpleasant experience. So how do you manage, how do you defend an inspection? What's important? Have a plan, have an SOP. When you write out your SOP, make sure the people involved know what to expect during an inspection. They should know their roles. It's important that you know your rights. As we saw very briefly when we talked about some of the provisions of the IOM, FDA is not going to explain to you your rights. You're supposed to know them. They're a law enforcement agency, and if you don't assert your rights, they're not going to say, well, you really don't want me looking at those records because the FDCA isn't clear that I can. You have to assert your rights. Make sure that you're in a position to decrease disruptions during the inspection. Your SOP should cover how to respond to FDA findings. It should have an outline for what you're going to do in an opening meeting. FDA, my experience, and Bob and Tara have, I know, feel the same way, is if when FDA arrives, you have a drill. You know what's going to go on. You know what's going to happen. And you're going to take the investigator into an opening meeting where you're going to talk about your company. If the company president is on site, it's always great for him or her to show up at this kind of meeting, talk about the company, have an org chart, have a facility map. It sends a very important company knows what it's doing, it's prepared for the inspection, and senior management cares. You should also be in a position to understand that you need that you're going to have a worm. You're going to have your own area of the facility where you can set up review documents FDA has asked for before they get turned over. and that's so you understand what you're giving FDA. So you have the opportunity to make copies of whatever you're going to give the agency. Setting up and reviewing the war room is not to be in a position to say, well, let's just say we can't find these papers. That would take us back to the 1001 issue. But it's there so that you know what you're doing. You have a chance to look at anything before you turn it over to FDA. This goes back to the opening meeting and why it's important. Because you can set the tone for the entire inspection by how you handle this. And this starts even at the person who lets people into your facility, your receptionist, who manages your waiting area. I've seen situations where the receptionist hasn't been briefed, doesn't know what's going to happen. FDA has shown up. They come in very officially. They say, we're FDA, we're here to conduct a notice, to conduct an inspection. Here's your 482. They flash their shields, and the receptionist panics and says, oh, come in, do what you have to do. Doesn't notify anybody. And again, FDA, the investigators are going to say, wow, this is great. We can go right in and do what we want. Nobody's going to bother us. We can really say, well, a receptionist, you really should call management and let them know we're here. So there's a lot of detail that goes into being prepared. And the receptionist should, the drill really should be for the receptionist to notify immediately the person on the site who's responsible for handling the inspection. That's the person that the agents, the investigators should give the notice of inspection to. And the minute this drill starts, everybody, all department managers, QC and QA official should be put on notice, and they should be prepared to go in to the opening meeting. Generally, QA leads the meeting. Again, if senior management, again, is on site, it's great to have them come in to introduce them, but it's not necessary for the senior management to lead the opening meeting. There's some obvious guidelines for how the opening meeting should be conducted. If you can show a PowerPoint, if you've got a nice conference room, if you have a boardroom, again, it's really important. If you have a nice area and you can do your opening meeting there, it sends very important signals to the investigators. And the meeting can go 15, 20 minutes. You're going to have, as I said, a PowerPoint, a slideshow, org charts, floor plans, lists of products manufactured and marketed, a diagram of product flow, a list of equipment. If you've had CGMP accomplishments, brag about it. Let them know. If you go to our 2-day course in Denver, this is an advertisement, you complete it, you get your certificate, you take the exam we offer, tell FDA. We just had 3 people from our quality department and our senior vice president for regulatory affairs attend an EAS GMP course. It all goes to initial signaling and setting the tone for how the inspection is going to go. Your war room that I mentioned, that's where all FDA requests for information should be funneled, where you're going to retrieve and review all documents before you hand them to FDA. So you're not supposed to alter documents. You can't. If there's something obviously wrong, you can't fix it. But as a general proposition, if there's some internal sticky notes that aren't officially part of the document and shouldn't be there, it's generally okay to remove them. But you need somebody responsible in a position to make that kind of judgment, to ensure that anything provided to FDA is what FDA actually requested, and to make copies. I cannot stress this enough, to make copies of everything provided to the agency. That includes documents, and you should have a drill set up where anything FDA samples, you keep 2 of that item for yourself, be it finished product, be it in-process material, be it raw material, be it product labels, labeling, to be where at the end of the day, you keep the notes that you have kept of what's happening during the inspection. Your SOP should provide for almost all of this. It should designate somebody who's responsible for interacting with the investigator, and if you've got a large enough staff, it should designate who's responsible for accompanying the contact person, the person who interacts with FDA. Because if you're the one interacting with FDA, you're probably going to be pretty busy. It's immensely helpful to have a person specifically designated to follow your company representative and the investigator or investigators around the facility and take notes of all activity, to just write down everything that's going on, the questions that are asked, the areas that are looked at. The scribe is typically somebody from QC/QA, but if you don't have somebody like that available, it's important to have somebody fill that role. The people who are interacting with FDA should know some of the things we've been speaking about today. They should understand FDA's authority, what records they're allowed to look at, policies regarding photographs, signing documents. With the exception of receipts and those couple of official documents we discussed, our policy is that our clients shouldn't sign any document, and other than those, in particular, any affidavit FDA might present to you, with the one exception to the affidavit being, instead of using a formal receipt situations where the investigators use an affidavit that specifically lists out the items that have been sampled. In those cases, we do not, we tell our clients you can sign those receipts. It makes life, or that kind of affidavit, the receipt affidavit, it makes the investigator's life easier. You don't want to make things harder for them if you don't have to, but please read anything before you sign it, because what you don't want to do is sign a receipt acknowledging that you gave the investigator 5 adulterated bottles of vitamin C. That would be a very bad thing. Access to employees, as I said, they're allowed to speak to, but not interrogate employees. You're permitted to be present. Recordings are greatly discouraged. Any client that consults with us, we advise do not record, do not video the inspection. If you video the inspection, well, then FDA definitely can take pictures, and the investigators may say, you know what, we're going to videotape you and videotaping us. It's generally not a good idea to even contemplate getting into that area. This goes back to what we were talking about, the person accompanying the contact person, point of contact for the company and FDA. And I'm repeating this because it's so important, because Bob, Tara, and I have all been in situations where we've had clients tell us FDA took a bunch of samples. What did they take? Well, we don't really know. They took some random things from the warehouse. It's really hard for your consultants, your lawyer, your account, figure out what's going on with FDA if we don't know what they were looking at. Keep matching sets of labels. Make sure you get your receipt. Keep every document that they take out. FDA at times can be pushy about affidavits. These come up usually in the closeout session when the investigation is over, the time where you're going to be getting your 483. You're not required to sign. We urge our clients not to sign them. Sometimes FDA will say, well, can you just skim it to make sure that we don't have anything wrong in it? There have been cases where we've seen typos, intentional typos in somebody's name, which if you correct, the investigator will say, well, they corrected the typo in the name, they didn't correct anything else, so everything else in the affidavit has to be accurate, even if it isn't signed. So our advice is very strongly, if you're presented with an affidavit, the investigator is not willing to accept, our lawyer advises us not to sign, just refer the investigator to your legal counsel. In almost every situation, be it affidavits, photographs, access to records, we tell our clients, if there's an issue, go back into the investigator's room, call us, and let us be the ones to say no. That way you can blame your lawyer. Your lawyer is telling us don't do it. We have no problem saying no to FDA, and a lot of times it makes the situation a little bit better than if the client is the one directly responding to a request in the negative. If the inspection is multi-day, and in the era of GMPs, it is likely to be, don't be surprised if these things go on for a week, but do daily wrap-ups. One thing that I didn't mention that really should be in your SOP is if you have a counsel who advises you, or if you work with a consultant, if FDA shows up, let them know. Make sure that they are available to you if there is an issue. You should use your war room to have these daily wrap-ups. Your team should discuss what's going on. If there is an issue that can be corrected immediately, that night after FDA is gone, make the correction. And then when they come back the next morning, tell them you've made the correction. I've seen many instances where we spoke about warehouses where the investigators have said you don't have enough space between the wall and your pallets. We can't see what's happening back there. That's an easy correction. Make the correction, get the pallets moved off the wall, and then bring the investigator back and show him or her that you've done this. And while you may not avoid a citation in a 483 that your pallets were too close to the wall, the investigator will note that you took the corrective action immediately during the inspection. What's a 483? It's important to understand this document. It's a factual listing of objectionable conditions. It may be annotated by investigators. It's presented at the end of the inspection. Corrective action should be acknowledged. Disputed observations or technical issues should be noted. However, we strongly advise don't argue with FDA when it presents the 483. If there's just something blatantly wrong, you can mention it, but don't get into an argument. So you'll get the 483. Hopefully you'll respond to it adequately. At the end of the inspection, when everything's really done, you're entitled to see what's called the EIR, Establishment Inspection Report. It's prepared by the inspection team. It's much more detailed than the 483. It potentially recommends appropriate action to the compliance officials, but it's much more detailed, and it's really a good idea in those districts where it's mailed to you automatically to read it. In some districts, you have to call the investigator and ask for it, but it's really a very good idea to get a hold of these EIRs and to review them. After the inspection, post-inspection management, you need to address anything in a 483, get going, get your counsel involved, get your consultants involved. Companies that try to respond to these things on their own almost always end up with a warning letter. Make sure whatever you tell FDA you're going to do, you will do. Vitally, vitally important. Some inspections then without a 483, no action indicated, you'll just get an EIR. But it's important. Know your rights, be prepared that you'll have no significant issues during any kind of inspection or other action with FDA. And as we like to say, don't be scared, be prepared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple questions. Our first one is going back to Tara's presentation. And the question is it a requirement to test for the presence of botanicals in a finished product? And what do you do if there is no test method?
So for botanical, the answer to that is yes. So you need to demonstrate that you've met all of your strength claims on the finished product label. So you'll have to have an appropriate test to do that. Now, if there isn't a scientifically valid test method available, and the FDA has described a scientifically valid test method as one that is accurate, precise, consistently does what it's intended to do, and specific. So if a test is not available, in the case of a botanical, this is often if you're claiming the botanical as a whole part. If that is the case, then you will not have a test method that you can use. However, there may be a test that's available for the constituent, the chemical constituent that's in that botanical, to demonstrate that that is there at the right ratio. So you may have to do that testing. The other alternative is there is an allocation for an exemption that's in 11175D1. So if that's the case, you may be able to rely on a variety of other things, and that includes the raw material testing of that material, the controls that you have in the warehouse to demonstrate that it's been identified the whole time as contaminated, mixed up, or hasn't deteriorated during your storage. You have a master formulation that demonstrates that this amount of the material is going to reflect this amount in the finished product. You have a master manufacturing record that you execute in a batch production record that shows that it was put into the formulation and verified by a second person. You have in-process controls, and then of course you have other finished product testing that you've done. So collectively, all of these things can be used to demonstrate that if there isn't a scientifically valid test method available. And of course, you would have to have an SOP that describes this entire process. And for particular products, you would have to have some sort of a justification document when you have to use that exemption.
Our second question is, how does FDA determine who to routinely inspect?
This is Bob Fish. I'll take a shot at that question. FDA has general work plans that they develop on an annual basis that really lays out the number of inspections they plan to do in various different commodity areas on a surveillance basis. With their limited resources, they cannot inspect everybody every 2 years as the law really requires. But then, of course, there are so-called compliance inspections or follow-up to previous inspections where there were a lot of violations. If you had a very lengthy 483, you can be sure that they're going to be back to inspect you again. Hopefully, you don't get a warning letter, but if you do get a warning letter, there may well be additional inspections. So there's surveillance inspections, which they plan on an annual basis, and then the compliance inspections, which are really as.
Thank you. Right now, those are the only two questions we've received. So Tara, would you like to discuss the 2-day training in Denver. And Mark, would you mind tabbing forward to that slide?
Yeah, so what we've just done for the last 2 days, so today and last Thursday, so we had a brief short course on the dietary supplement GMPs that are dictated in 21 CFR 111, as well as some other statutory requirements that we've introduced to you. But there is an extensive live 2-day training that we're doing in Denver on April 4th and 5th with the same 3 participants that we've had today. So with Bob Fish and Mark Ullman and myself. So we will all be there for that 2-day training. It's a fantastic training that goes through all of these parts that we've talked about, as well as all the other subparts of the regulation. And we do have some additional topics on SOPs themselves, quality agreements, the stability program. So it's a really fantastic course to train your personnel on the GMPs. Annual GMP training is a requirement by the FDA, so it is something that you do have to conduct, and this is a great way to get them exposed to all that. The attendees will get a certificate at the conclusion of the training. So again, it's a great tool. So we've gotten a lot of really good feedback about the training. There is a discount code, as well. So if you use the code GMP99 when you sign up and register for the course, you'll save the $99 that you use for this particular registration for the last 2 days GMP training. So we all hope to see you there. And this is close to my hometown, so I'm in Colorado. So.
All right, well, thanks again to the 3 of you for a fantastic 2-day presentation. Thanks to everyone who registered. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks so much.